At its peak in 2007, Nokia had 40% of the global market share and connected 1.5 billion people globally. It accounted for a third of the market cap of the Helsinki Stock Exchange and contributed to 1.6% of Finland's GDP and 16% of exports. If you were born any time before the noughts, chances are your first phone was a Nokia. I still remember my favorite one, the 8890. It had a sleek metallic casing with a sliding cover and, wait for it, an electric blue backlight. Cannot tell you how many times I threw that phone across the room. Those things were indestructible. And it doesn't make me feel any younger to say that this was a little less than 20 years ago. Do you all remember the ringtone? Da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da-da. Hi, I'm Marilyn Zahur, CEO and founder of Cosmic Centaurs, and you're listening to Center Stage. It is ingrained in human nature to love a good story, and in my years of experience and learning, I collected a number of stories from companies and leaders who've either succeeded brilliantly or failed tragically. What lessons can we learn from these stories? That's what Center Stage is all about. In our last episode, we saw how getting both the beautiful basics and the big bets right revived a company from the brink of collapse. In this episode of the third season of Center Stage, we're looking at the flip side of that coin. What happens when a company crumbles under the weight of its own internal expectations, failing to meet its new competition in the market? This, our listeners, is the Nokia story, from mobile giant to nostalgic memory. The story begins about 140 years ago, specifically in 1865, in a town called Tampere, and I'm sure I butchered that, in Finland. Then under the rule of the Russian Empire, Frederick Idestam, a mining engineer, established a pulp mill to produce paper. And a few years later, he opened a second one. Together with his friend Leo Mechelin, Idestam formed a company and named it, you guessed it, Nokia, inspired by the Nokian Virta River, on the banks of which they established that second mill. The company produced paper exclusively for quite a while, until 1896, when Idestam stepped down and Mechelin took over with expansion on his mind. In the first century of its life, Nokia would go from producing paper to generating electricity to manufacturing rubber to producing medical equipments like respirators. Nokia, now an independent Finland, was quickly growing to become a multi-industry titan. In the early 70s, Nokia made its first move in the comms and radio industries, making professional mobile radios, telephone switches, and even televisions at one point. In fact, Nokia became such a tech titan that it earned Finland the title of Nordic Japan. In 1981, the company accelerated its mobile phone business considerably. It launched the Nordic mobile phone telephone service, the world's very first international cellular network, and the first to allow international roaming. A year later, it introduced the first car phone, the Mobira Senator, as well as Nokia DX200, the company's first digital telephone switch. In 1984, it launched the first portable car phone, a chunky and elegant piece of mobile technology, but a start nonetheless. And this was all ramping up to the monumental year of 1987, when Nokia introduced the Mobira Cityman, one of the very first commercially available handheld mobile phones. It came at a hefty 800 grams and a similarly hefty price of 24,000 Finnish marks, about 3,400 pounds. Expensive? Yeah. Groundbreaking? Most certainly. Things picked up quickly from here. In 1991, the Finnish Prime Minister, Harri Holkeri, made the world's first call on the Global System for Mobile Communications, or GSM, as you all know it, using Nokia equipment. And a year later, Nokia president and chief executive Jorma Ollila decided to focus Nokia's operations on mobile phones, selling off rubber, consumer electronics, and other manufacturing divisions, to instead focus on launching the company's first GSM-enabled digital handheld, the 1011. 2 years later, in 94, the company launched its landmark 2100 series, the first to feature the iconic ringtone. And while they had a humble target of selling 400,000 of those phones, the demand was quite insane. The series would go on to sell 20 million phones worldwide, making the company the world leader in the mobile phones market by 1998. For comparison, BlackBerry sold about 22 million phones. And so that's how big that was. And if you want to talk more numbers, Nokia's turnover increased almost fivefold during this time, from 6.5 billion euros to almost 31 billion euros in 2001. Nokia was simply untouchable. And it was going from height to height, from first to first. In 97, it launched the first Go phone with the game Snake. And I'm not ashamed to say, I played Snake instead of listening to my history professor 10 times out of 10. In 99, a phone capable of basic web functions, including email. In 2000, it struck a deal with music publisher EMI and enabled users to choose their favorite tunes as ringtones, and starting a ringtone fad that would last for years. In 2001, its first phone with a built-in camera. The year after that, video capture. The same year, 3G phone. And in 2003, Nokia released its pièce de résistance, the 1100, a basic phone with the primary purpose of affordability and accessibility. And to this day, that line is the best-selling mobile phone line in history, with over 250 million phones sold. That's more than any single iPhone release cycle in history, if you can wrap your head around that. To quote Yves Dawes, INSEAD professor, they were leading the fastest growing industry ever, and they were the fastest growing industrial company ever. But then, drama. 2007 presented the first speed bump in the Nokia story. The mobile device market saw new players who simply weren't playing. Apple introduced the first iPhone, which replaced physical buttons with a user-friendly touch interface and the finger gestures we so commonly use today. Windows introduced the Mobile 7, showing commitment to competing in that space. Even Google took everyone by surprise with the introduction of the Android platform, which would become a staple operating system, as we all know. Traditional brick phones began being commoditized, with Chinese vendors gaining ground, especially in emerging markets. And in response, what did Nokia do? They lowered their prices and profit per phone. And by 2009, Nokia's phone profits were at the lowest they'd been in 8 years, despite revenue being second highest in that period. To simplify, Nokia was selling huge numbers of low-end phones and yielding very little profits on each one. Nokia's hardware and software struggled too. On the hardware side, Nokia was slow to incorporate touchscreen technology, with its flagship, the N97, launching in 2009, 2 full years after Apple. Not only that, but Nokia's answer to Apple was too expensive and inferior. In 2013 interview, a former Nokia engineer said, "We had the best hardware in the industry, but we didn't see the software and ecosystem as equally important. By the time we realized our mistake, it was too late. Apple and Google had already established their foothold." The move to this platform and software ecosystem from what was a very product-oriented and manufacturing business meant that Nokia needed to acquire new capabilities, think of new revenue models. While we saw Fujifilm leverage their unique capabilities to reinvent themselves in our previous episode, Nokia struggled to align talent capabilities towards the transition and build this alliance-based model that was needed to navigate the shift. Let's take app developers as an example. How could developers make their apps compatible for Nokia's bigger and more diverse range of phones? With Apple's iOS and Android phones, app development was easy. The same app would travel from one device to the next. But Nokia required developers to tailor fit their apps to different devices and screens and different lines, a task that seemed incredibly demanding and unrewarding. In fact, many years ago, more than 10 years ago, I worked for a company where we were given a grant to develop apps for Nokia, and I remember how hellish it was versus the iOS and Android developments. Even though Some analysts believe that Nokia still had a competitive advantage. First, it had a great distribution network. From villages in the mountains of India to the arid plains of northern Nigeria, Nokia was everywhere. The only region where Nokia's market penetration and distribution were weak and vulnerable was North America. Next, Nokia had robust intellectual property that theoretically put it ahead of its competition. In fact, in 2009, Nokia filed a suit against Apple in which it claimed that the iPhone maker had violated no less than 46 Nokia patents, including ones covering wireless standards, antennas, cameras, click wheels, touchscreen controls. And Apple did agree to settle for an undisclosed cash payment and ongoing royalties. Now, given these advantages, could Nokia, which by the way had reinvented itself many times in its 100 plus years, get its act together in time to regain its hold in the mobile device space? Obviously, we all know the answer to this question, but we're here to talk about what went wrong. Now, most case studies will tell you the Nokia overvalued its brand and technology, underestimated its competitors. They'll tell you they botched their marketing, they developed the wrong products, they didn't focus enough on the software side, or even that they ignored consumer preferences altogether. And listen, while all of that is absolutely true, these were all symptoms of something else. And we're interested in taking you to a deeper level, beneath the skin, so to speak, to understand how the organization's structure, leadership, culture, processes were in fact the real root cause of this deer in the headlights moment. So, Nokia, for the first time, no longer the big fish in the pond, it had to stare down the barrel of strategic uncertainty. George Linardos, who was Nokia's vice president of products, media, and games at the time, said, "It was the year 2007, and Nokia had just posted a record 7.2 billion profit. I remember having a very distinct discussion with my boss about how sales were going great, our stock price were great, we were on top of the world. But it felt like we were now leaving the light and walking into a forest with darkness ahead." Now, the boss that Linardos is referring to here is, of course, Olli-Pekka Kalaspo, the president and CEO of Nokia between 2006 and 2010. For ease, we'll call him Olli-Pekka. Olli-Pekka joined Nokia in 1980, well before the company's mobile phone prime, and he climbed the corporate ladder. Now, but listen to what jobs he held. He was a lawyer by training. He was corporate counsel, then CFO, then COO, and then became CEO in 2006. And while the smartphone market was booming, Olli-Pekka's Nokia focused on making more brick phones and selling more brick phones. After Nokia conducted a global market study, in 2007, it identified 12 different types of consumers and decided to meet every one of those identities by introducing 50 products a year, each with an average life cycle of 1 to 2 years. Each product needed a ramp up, each product needed a ramp down, each product needed resources, and took away from Nokia's ability to make something that would allow it to catch up to the competition. This more is more culture was reflected internally, where the company's R&D and operations became incredibly fragmented and complex. Take, for example, Nokia's attempt at building a new operating software for its smartphone. A small team with very limited resources was tasked with developing a new OS, codenamed Maemo, from the ground up. But internally, the team competed with another team that tried to revamp Symbian, the aging operating model system that ran most of Nokia's smartphones. And according to Maemo team members, the Symbian team directors were afraid of Maemo devaluing their Symbian-based communicator phones. And allegedly, they used their position to influence resource allocation. Overall, Nokia had nearly 2,000 people working on their various OS projects. Meanwhile, Google was able to deliver Android with a reported 400 to 500 people. Did Google or Apple have better engineers? Did Google or Apple know something that Nokia didn't? No, that's not it. You have to remember, Nokia had the smartest engineers and talent in the world working for them. In the context of the day, landing a job at Nokia was like landing a job at Google or Amazon. The brightest minds were competing to work there, and by all accounts, the company knew as early as the 90s what needed to be done. But knowing and doing are two very different things. Nokia's incredibly complex organizational structure, combined with ineffective leadership, meant that the company was always late to act. Surprisingly, Olli-Pekka himself would later admit to many of these shortcomings in interviews. Now, key amongst their missteps was a very poorly executed reorg into a matrix structure in 2004 and the reallocation of crucial leadership roles. Let me tell you about that. So, obviously, there are tensions that are inherent in all matrix organizations, where different groups with diverse priority must find ways to work together. But those were particularly pronounced at Nokia. Accustomed to decentralized initiatives, Nokia's mid-level executives lacked the experience and training for what we call the integrative process, the negotiations, the empathy that are necessary in a matrix structure. Unlike what we saw at Fujifilm, Nokia neglected essential aspects of good matrix structures, such as resource allocation. The matrix was a bit too slanted in favor of product families and managers. And other teams, marketing, software, etc., they became supplier to the product teams. Executives with P&L responsibilities would clash with the managers of horizontal resource platforms. On the other hand, the leadership team restructure fueled this discord even further. The original success of Nokia was attributed to their executive team, the so-called Dream Team. Following the reorg, the departure of many of them led to a vacuum in vision and strategy, the extent of which was only later recognized. How would you react if I told you that between 2007 and 2010, the role of Chief Technology Officer was removed from the executive team? Top managers now had strong business backgrounds but lacked technological competence, making it very hard for them to understand the technological challenges ahead and steer the company. What kind of tech company doesn't have a CTO? I would say a manufacturing company disguised as a tech company. Now, in addition to these structural challenges, the leadership and culture of the org further led to the downfall, a deadly cocktail of boring, rigidity, hubris, and fear. Olli-Pekka's leadership style was often described as uncharismatic. He had a law and banking background, and it made him focus on efficiency, mass production, scaling. But he lacked vision and the ability to effectively execute in an innovative and adaptive manner. Nokia's corporate culture was known for its rigid and hierarchical structure, which made it very difficult to adapt to the fast-paced changes in the technology sector. Juhani Risku, a former Nokia employee, mentioned in his book, The Nokia Saga, that Nokia had become a bureaucratic giant, where decisions were slow, risk-taking was minimized, and there was a prevailing attitude that we know best, which prevented us from seeing the writing on the wall. Under Olli-Pekka's leadership, Nokia's top managers were also known for their intimidating behavior. Description of board members and senior executives often highlighted their extremely temperamental nature, with instances of them shouting at the top of their lungs being commonplace. The threat of firings or demotions was a frequent concern. There was a climate of fear, a reluctance to share honest feedback, a culture of what was later called pluralistic silence, where honest feedback was discouraged. One consultant mentioned that this made it extremely challenging to convey unwelcome news. Middle managers reported on progress optimistically and to a certain extent falsely, downplaying challenges to avoid upsetting the leadership team. Olli-Pekka himself said, managers tended to put heavy pressure on subordinates to deliver more and faster, not accepting no for an answer, thereby increasing their subordinates' fear of reporting honest feedback. One middle manager who suggested to a colleague that he could maybe challenge his boss about something he disagreed on, his colleague answered that he didn't have the courage and that he had a family and small children. Another shared that the information didn't flow upwards. Top management was directly lied to. He says, I remember examples when you had a chart and the supervisor told you to move the data point to the right to give a better impression I'm sorry, something just rang, to give a better impression. Then your supervisor went to present it to the higher level executives. There were situations where everybody knew things were going wrong, but we were thinking, why tell top manager about this? It won't take things any better. We discussed this kind of choice openly. According to an HBR article on innovative organizational cultures, psychological safety, a concept explaining individuals' feelings of safety to make mistakes and openly speak about problems without fear or reprisal is key to not only helping organizations avoid catastrophic errors, but also support learning and innovation. It's actually quite simple. If you don't think that you can make mistakes, if you don't think that you can share your opinion openly, if you keep all of these things to yourself, then you will never try new things. And if you don't try new things, you can't innovate. You know, this whole culture of failing fast. It is a bit of a fad. It is a bit of a, overused sentence, but psychological safety is necessary to innovate, and Nokia needed that desperately. In addition to the uncertainty that was imposed by the market shifting from under their feet, Nokia's culture of fear and performance further increased the uncertainty faced by its employees and stifled that innovation. In other words, Nokia's culture was not exactly connecting people. As a consequence, managers overpromised and underdelivered, and senior leaders who lacked the technical skills to make informed decisions gave resources to the wrong people. They gave resources to people who said they could show progress rather than making strategic investments. They were focused on short-term thinking, on the P&L of the product lines. And as a result, Nokia focused an excessive amount of attention, money, resources on developing new phone models to meet immediate market demands, but neglecting the critical development of an operating system necessary to reinvent itself in this emerging world, and effectively sounding the death bell of the company. By 2010, Nokia had lost 75% of its market cap, from $40 a share in 2007 to 10 in 2010. And while shares of Apple and Research in Motion, the maker of BlackBerry, had valued by more than 80%, Apple's market cap was now 3 times Nokia's. After 3 years of failed strategies and many market moves later, the Nokia board met in a boardroom that seemed as gloomy as the Baltic Sea it overlooked. In the airy wood paneled spaces of Nokia's headquarters, with its huge windows capturing the light, the board spent an entire day debating strategic alternatives. Their only way forward was to fire Olli-Pekka as the CEO of Nokia, but by then, it was too late. Nokia tried to salvage its phone business, partnering with Microsoft in 2011 and adopting Windows Phone 7 as the primary operating system. But their market share just dwindled and stock prices dropped below $2 by 2012. And in 2013, Nokia announced the sale of its mobile and devices division to Microsoft for just 5.4 billion euros. This was a company that had once posted profits of 7.1 billion, a fraction of what it was worth, that 5.4. And effectively, it ended its storied participation in the mobile phone space. Olli-Pekka once said, in order for an organization to change, you need either a charismatic leader or a crisis. At least Nokia had a crisis. But I would argue that it's not an either or, rather an and. In times of crisis, organizations are summoned to change, and this can only be done under the impulse of a visionary leader. As we saw with Komori at Fujifilm, reinvention in the midst of a crisis was a combination of big ideas and beautiful basics, and a focus on both the present and the future, executed masterfully by a strong leader with no small amount of courage. Even Olli-Pekka agrees to this, and I quote, "You need to have years of economies of scale, and you need to have flexibility and responsiveness, and then you need to find the right balance between the two." We needed to be more proactive in areas of technology and functionality, in coming early to the market, emphasizing time to market, not just economies of scale. In essence, Olli-Pekka focused on efficiency and scale and mismanaged the innovation process. failing to steer the ship during a moment of what we would call emergence. He leveraged what Nokia already had, but not what it could become. And this reminded me of a conversation that I had with Joe Santos last year at the closing of our Cosmic Conference about leading through time, and particularly during times of emergence. Now, maybe I should start by explaining what emergence means. Emergence is the fact of something becoming known or starting to exist. It causes us to go from one state of equilibrium to another. In that moment, uncertainty in its true sense dominates and creates an inability to know the future. It can only be revealed through time. The pandemic was an emergence. AI is an emergence. If you had asked the manager in the pandemic how long it would last, what would the consequences be, they would not have been able to give you that answer. And it was the same for Nokia. They didn't understand how fast things were going to change and how much. Now, what Joe Santos says is that traditional management theory, unfortunately, doesn't tell leaders how to lead through emergence. Developed by engineers and neoclassical economists, most views of management, the stuff I learned in my MBA, they presuppose that the market is in a state of equilibrium. But it isn't. That is when true leadership comes in the absence of the management theories. In periods of emergence, we need to use our imagination rather than our knowledge. True leaders emerge in response to uncertainty. They understand that their environment is complex, and they use this imagination to envision a future that goes beyond what they know, influencing not only the trajectory of their organizations, but also shaping the future. This involves thinking beyond existing paradigms, understanding complexity, being open to emergence, and utilizing knowledge to envision a future that goes beyond what is currently known or understood. Imagination becomes a powerful tool for leaders in a rapidly changing world. It is in these periods of emergence that you need leaders who can see an image, a vision, and rally people around it. In some ways, these leaders absorb the uncertainty and allow their teams to focus on the task at hand without constant worry about tomorrow. When people spoke about Steve Jobs, they spoke about his reality distortion field. That's what we're talking about. But the stories of Nokia or Kodak tell us what happens when leaders ignore emergence and fail to produce and bring to life the rallying vision that can shape the future. I hope you enjoyed today's episode of Center Stage with me, Marilyn Zahour, the show where I talk about the most common challenges leaders face and how they address them to inspire you to become better leaders. Our team at Cosmic Centaurs frequently posts articles about organizational development, leadership, and the future of work on cosmiccentaurs.com, as well as content on our social media. You can follow us there, and you can also subscribe to our newsletters. We'll keep the link in the comment for you. Join me again in our next episode where we explore the story of Mars.